I left Europe a few days later. There were no arguments, no lawyers, no dramatic confrontations, just a quiet flight back to the United States. But quiet on the outside didn't mean quiet inside my head. 450,000 euros. That number kept repeating itself over and over during the flight. 450,000 euros. It isn't the kind of money you just shrug off and forget about. No matter how successful you are in business, that kind of loss stays with you. And that wasn't even the full amount. There were hotel bills, flights, meals, transportation, weeks of living expenses in Europe. When you added everything together, the real loss was even higher. So most of that flight was spent replaying the entire 2-month experience in my mind. Every conversation, every decision, every moment where I might have done something differently. I kept asking myself the same question. How did something that started with so much promise end like this? At one point, I even wondered if going back to Uruguay might somehow help recover the money. But that thought didn't last long. I wasn't naive. Once the contract had been signed and the money distributed, the chances of recovering anything were almost non-existent. International disputes like that could take years, multiple courts, multiple countries, lawyers on every side, and there was still no guarantee of winning. So I pushed that idea out of my mind. Still, the loss kept creeping back in. 450,000 euros. Again and again. It sat there in my thoughts like a weight I couldn't shake. But somewhere in the middle of that long flight, another thought started to form. Because despite everything that had happened, those 2 months in Europe had exposed me to something I had never experienced before. The world of international football, the movement of players between countries, the negotiations behind the scenes, the enormous sums of money that could change hands when the right talent appeared. Before that trip, football transfers were something I had only heard about in the news. Now, I had seen the machinery up close, and the numbers involved were staggering. Clubs spending millions, agents earning fortunes, young players changing the trajectory of their entire lives overnight. That world had always existed. I had simply never stepped inside it before. And now that I had, it was impossible not to think about the possibilities. But every time I tried to imagine how I might become part of it, the same problem returned. 450,000 euros. The loss kept pulling my mind back to the past, back to the betrayal, back to the mistake, back to the deal that should never have happened the way it did. For most of the flight, I was stuck in that loop until about an hour before we landed. That's when the question finally appeared. A simple question. What if? What if I tried again? Not the same way, not with the same people, but differently, more carefully, more intelligently. At first, the idea felt ridiculous. After all, I had just lost nearly 500,000 euros. Most people would take that as a very clear signal to stay away from the business entirely. But the more I thought about it, the more another realization settled in. My mistake wasn't entering the football world. My mistake was entering it blindly. I had trusted people I barely knew, shared information too easily, assumed everyone involved was working toward the same goal. Now I knew better. And knowledge changes everything. I started thinking about the United States first. Maybe I could help American players move to Europe. But the more I examined that idea, the less it made sense. At that time, American players simply didn't command the same transfer values as South American talent. The market was different. The demand wasn't the same, which meant the real opportunity was somewhere else. And that's when Uruguay came back into my mind. Not the established players, not the ones already known by agents and scouts. I was thinking about the younger ones, the disciplined kids, the ones still developing, players who had the raw ability but hadn't yet been discovered by the European clubs. If someone could identify those players early and guide them into the right environment, the value could be enormous. For the first time during that entire flight, the 450,000 euro loss faded into the background because suddenly I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what might still be possible. And by the time the plane began its descent into the United States, I could already see the direction my next move might take. 2 weeks after arriving back in the United States, I was on a plane again. This time I was heading to Uruguay. I wasn't going back to recover money. I already knew that wasn't realistic. I was going back to understand the system, to see how players were developed, how they moved from amateur clubs into professional football, how European teams found talent in places like this. Because if I was going to try again, I needed to understand the process from the beginning. But the moment I arrived, I realized something had changed. The story of what happened in Switzerland had already spread. In football circles, especially at the amateur level, news travels fast, clubs talk to each other, coaches share information, presidents know what's happening across the league, and by the time I started reaching out, most of them already knew who I was. The foreigner who paid hundreds of thousands of euros and walked away with nothing. From their perspective, I wasn't a potential partner. I was a risk. Many of them assumed I had come back for one reason: to take legal action. The amateur club that received the transfer money was part of a tight network. They all played in the same league. They knew each other personally. Some of them were friends. So when I started calling, the responses were cautious, polite, but distant. Some clubs said they were too busy. Others said I was welcome to stop by, but they couldn't guarantee they would have time. Most never returned my calls at all. Even the club that had received the transfer money avoided any contact. They believed I might be trying to build a case against them. And in that environment, no one wanted to be the one seen cooperating with me. The player's family was also afraid. They lived modestly. The idea of being pulled into a legal dispute, possibly across countries, was overwhelming. From their perspective, I wasn't someone bringing opportunity. I was someone who could bring problems. For nearly a week, I tried everything. Phone calls, messages, introductions through contacts. Nothing worked. Every door I approached stayed closed. By the middle of the following week, it became clear I wasn't going to break through, not like this. So I left. I flew back to the United States with no meetings, no agreements, and no progress. Another trip, more time, more money spent, and nothing to show for it. But this time, something was different, because now I understood the real problem. Back in the United States, I went straight back to work. I still had a business to run, clients, deals, responsibilities that had nothing to do with football. On the surface, everything returned to normal. But mentally, I wasn't in the same place. Uruguay was still on my mind, not because of what I had lost, but because of what I didn't understand. That first trip back had made one thing very clear. I had approached it the wrong way. I had gone in like an outsider, trying to do business, making calls, requesting meetings, looking for cooperation. But in that environment, that approach doesn't work. Because in football culture, especially at the amateur level, relationships come before everything. And trust isn't given easily. It's built slowly, sometimes without a single word being spoken. I started thinking about how I could approach things differently, how I could remove the suspicion, how I could show people that I wasn't there to take anything from them, that I wasn't a threat, that I wasn't another foreigner looking to exploit their players, because that's how they saw me. And given what had happened, I couldn't blame them. So instead of trying to force meetings, I stepped back and I started thinking long term. If I wanted access, I needed acceptance. If I wanted acceptance, I needed trust. And if I wanted trust, I had to earn it. Not through contracts, not through promises, but through actions, real actions, the kind that people remember, the kind that travel through communities the same way rumors do, quietly, but effectively. I didn't have a complete plan yet, but I knew the next move couldn't look anything like the first. It had to be different, unexpected, something that would make people stop and reconsider who I was. Weeks went by. I focused on my work, but the idea never left me. It stayed there, developing in the background, until eventually it became clear. If I couldn't approach the clubs directly, then I needed to approach the community. And if I could reach the community, the clubs would follow. That's when I decided to go back, not with contracts, not with proposals, but with something no one was expecting. Something that would open a door without me having to knock on it. And that decision changed everything.